Brian's heart stopped when he saw Tank lying motionless on the grass, his powerful, fearless Rottweiler barely breathing. He dropped to his knees, shaking him, calling his name. The vet's words later confirmed his worst nightmare. Poison. Someone had tried to kill his dog, and Brian had a pretty good idea who, but instead of knocking on their door that night, he waited. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Tank's ears perked. Then, without warning, he bolted toward the fence. Tank, his large and fierce Rottweiler, sat by the fence. Now and then, his deep brown eyes would follow the movement of other animals, like an owl in a tree or a jumping cricket. Suddenly he stood up and ran toward the fence. What do you think made him run? Brian did not react. He had never been a man to trust easily. People had let Brian down. Tank never had. That was all that mattered. Which was why Brian did not like the Thompsons. The Thompsons moved in last year. Pristine hedges, fake smiles, and an immediate hatred for Tank. Too loud, too big, too dangerous. They complained to the HOA, animal control, anyone who'd listen. Then the complaint stopped, but Brian should have known better. 9 p.m. Something was off. Silence. Too much of it. Tank always barked. Tonight? Nothing. Brian set down his beer. Tank. Tank always came running. Not tonight. Brian frowned. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the fence. Come on, big guy, he said, softer this time. Still nothing. Then he saw him, and his blood grew cold. Tank was slumped on the ground. His body was shaking, and he was breathing heavily. But what sent Brian flying across the field was Tank's tongue. It hung loosely from his mouth, and it was even turning pale. What do you think happened? Tank! Brian's heart slammed against his ribs as he dropped beside the dog. Tank twitched, his tongue slack, his breaths ragged. His body trembled. Brian lifted Tank's face. Something cold. Half-eaten meat. Wet with Tank's saliva. Not his. Where did it come from? He sniffed. Chemical. Sharp. Poison. Brian's eyes grew wide and the piece of meat slipped from his fingers. XF. His mind snapped into overdrive. Tank was massive. Whatever poison had been used, it would take time to fully shut his body down, but it was working fast. Brian shoved his fingers into the dog's mouth, scraping at his tongue, trying to remove whatever traces of poison were left. Tank's body shuddered, but he did not get up. Brian was not expecting him to. He didn't hesitate. He flew to a nearby tap and washed his hands as thoroughly and as quickly as he could. Then he ran back to Tank and scooped the Rottweiler into his arms with all his 125 pounds of muscle. Tank was now limp, but still quite heavy. But Brian didn't mind. He stumbled toward the front yard where he parked his truck, threw open the passenger door, and laid Tank inside. The dog let out a weak whine, rolling his head against the seat. Brian threw the truck into gear. Tires spun. He floored it, knuckles white, jaw clenched. Rage. The Thompsons. He knew it was them. Brian's hands shook, but not from fear, from rage. As he sped to the hospital, one thought burned in his mind. He couldn't let them win. The streets were a blur. Streetlights flashed by in streaks of yellow and white, but Brian barely saw them. Tank lay in the passenger seat, unnaturally still, and every few seconds a ragged wheeze escaped his throat. "Stay with me, buddy," Brian muttered, barely recognizing his voice. He pushed the truck harder, and the speedometer needle crept past the limit. The emergency clinic's parking lot was nearly empty when Brian pulled up. He was out of the truck before the engine fully shut off. Then he yanked the passenger door open and hauled Tank into his arms. A vet tech ran out. "What happened?" "Poison," Brian spat. The vet grabbed Tank, rushed him inside. Doors slammed, a flurry of movement, IVs, needles, hands working fast. Brian stood frozen, fists clenched. Tank lay on the table, too still. "Not like this, please." Brian hovered just outside the exam room. He was so scared his pulse hammered in his ears as the vets worked. He peeped again and saw that one of the vets, Dr. Reynolds, was already inserting an IV into Tank's foreleg, and another was preparing an injection. Brian tried to calm his breathing, but it did not help the tightness in his chest. He paced around for several seconds that turned into minutes, and then stretched into what felt like hours. He could not sit or think. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides as he hoped his beloved Tank survived the ordeal. Finally, Dr. Reynolds opened the door and walked out, peeling off his gloves. Brian was beside him immediately. "You brought him in time," he smiled reassuringly, "but the next few hours will be critical." Brian's mind wrestled between relief and fury. "He is stable," the vet continued, "but I need to be honest. He ingested a deadly dose. We still have to observe him. If you had waited any longer—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Brian nodded. He already knew how that sentence ended. He turned to the glass window separating him from the exam room. Tank lay on the table, hooked up to fluids, his chest rising and falling. His large Rottweiler had never looked so small. His best friend, his protector, is reduced to this. Luckily, the hours passed quickly, and Tank only got better and better. When he got Tank home, his rage had calmed a little, but he was not prepared for how strange the house would feel. It felt too quiet without Tank's loud barking, and without him running in between his legs. He settled the Rottweiler on his bed in the living room and arranged blankets around him. Then he knelt beside him and ran a hand over his thick fur. "You're gonna be okay, bud," he murmured. "I got you." He tried to sleep too, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the half-eaten piece of meat in the grass and Tank's tongue hanging loose. The Thompsons. They had been complaining about Tank for months. He barked too much. He was too big for the neighborhood. Once Mrs. Thompson had even screamed at Brian over the fence and said, "That thing could rip someone's throat out." They had decided they hated him enough to kill him. Brian shook his head. He could storm over to their house, pound on their door, and scream accusations in their smug faces. But no, not yet. Instead, Brian decided to do something he knew how to do best: watch and wait. Because sometimes karma works on its timeline. Let them think they got away with it. Let them believe the dog was dead. And then let them see what life was like without him. At dawn, he pulled a chair up to the front window and settled in with a fresh cup of coffee. The Thompsons came outside around 7 a.m. like clockwork. Mrs. Thompson was in her usual yoga gear, and Mr. Thompson was already in his business suit. They glanced at his yard immediately and smiled when they didn't see the barking dog. They thought Tank was dead, Brian realized. He felt his anger build, but he held himself down. Suddenly, their gazes locked. Brian smiled and he waved. The couple hesitated, then waved back weakly. They thought they had won, but they were very wrong. One night at 2 a.m., karma came knocking on their door, and it had 4 legs. It was 2 nights after Tank returned. The neighborhood had settled for the night. The estate was so quiet and peaceful until tragedy struck. The sound of breaking glass shattered the stillness of the night. Brian was a light sleeper. Years in the military had trained him to wake at the sound of a pin drop, but this was no pin. A louder scream followed the loud crash. It was a raw, blood-curdling scream coming from the Thompsons' home. Brian sat up so fast. He threw off the covers and bolted to the window. From his room he could see a dark figure moving through the Thompsons' living room. Someone had broken in. Brian's eyes fell on the dog bed beside him. The Rottweiler was weak, but recovering. 2 days of food, rest, and constant care had done wonders. The worst of the poison was gone, at least. He rolled his lips and whistled. Tank's head shot up. "You hear that, Bud?" Brian asked, and the dog let out a low, guttural growl. Brian smirked. "Let's go." Across the fence in the Thompsons' house, the masked intruder moved swiftly through their bedroom, yanking drawers open and stuffing jewelry and cash into a large bag. He was armed, and Mrs. Thompson and her husband shivered on their bed as they stared down the barrel of the pistol he pointed at them. Mr. Thompson trembled. His wife sobbed. The gun aimed straight at them. No one was coming, or so they thought. Just a few yards away, Brian and Tank walked through the Thompsons' garden gate, which hung slightly ajar. Brian immediately knew the intruder must have broken in that way. Perfect. He and Tank crept inside and into a dim living room. He could hear Mrs. Thompson begging the robber, "Please, please, just take whatever you want." Brian locked eyes with Tank, no words needed. He pointed. The Rottweiler exploded forward. The dog jumped forward. His claws scraped against the hardwood as he lunged up the stairs. The growl that ripped from his throat was deep and guttural. Luckily, the burglar did not hear it, so he did not realize what was coming until it was too late. Tank, a 125-pound force of muscle and fury, barreled through the bedroom door at the man in a mask. The burglar only heard the click of his claws. He turned just in time to see Tank lunging at him. The man screamed even louder than Mrs. Thompson had and crashed on the floor. His head smacked against the hardwood floor. Brian took his time climbing the stairs. He reached the top just as Tank had landed on the terrified man and began barking in his face as he struggled to free himself. His mask had come off, and he was white and afraid as he struggled. "Get it off me! Get it off me!" he kept screaming. Tank did not even bite. Brian had trained him to only bite on provocation. He growled in his face, his snout inches from his face, but that was enough to have the intruder begging for his life. Brian leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Looks like you picked the wrong house," he joked. The man kept screaming and begging. Meters away, Mrs. Thompson was pressed into a corner, shaking in surprise and fear. Her eyes darted between the burglar and the beast standing over him. Mr. Thompson sat beside her, frozen too. The dog had jumped from nowhere just when they had thought they would lose everything. He had barreled in and saved their life. Their gazes met Brian's, and he smiled, not a friendly smile, a knowing one. Then he stepped inside and crouched beside Tank, close enough to see the whites of the intruder's panicked eyes. "You scared?" he asked. The man exhaled sharply. "That's funny. I bet the Thompsons were scared too just a few minutes ago, but that did not stop you." The sound of sirens caught Brian off. The police blazed in, and the blue and red from their lights blinked through the windows. The other neighbors stirred. Finally, porch lights flickered on, and heads peeked from behind curtains. They stumbled out their front doors, ready to gather details for their weekly gossip. Inside the bedroom, the intruder looked relieved. "The cops are here," he said, but Tank did not let him go. He swallowed hard as he tried to avoid the Rottweiler's glare. A moment later, the bedroom door burst open and officers flooded in with their guns drawn. It was only then Tank stepped off his chest. The officers were surprised to see the dog. They patted his head, then hauled the intruder up and immediately secured his wrists with handcuffs. The man was breathing heavily, but he did not try to struggle. He had no fight left in him. And the Thompsons? Mrs. Thompson still clutched the front of her robe. Occasionally her eyes moved between the officers, the intruder, and the dog that had just saved her life. Her husband wrapped his arms around her, like he was trying to keep her from falling apart. They were alive because of Tank, and they knew it. At last, Mrs. Thompson turned to Brain. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe a thank you, but the words never came. Brian did not need them. He spoke before she could. "You should fix that back gate," he said. Mr. Thompson nodded quickly. One of the officers walked up to them before Brian could leave. "You the one who called it in?" he asked Brian, and he nodded. The officer glanced down at Tank, who now sat obediently by Brian's side. "Hell of a dog you got there," he muttered, and Brian smirked. "Yeah, he's a good one." The officer nodded toward the Thompsons. "They're lucky you were around. Could have gone real bad." As it turned out, the burglar had been scouting houses for weeks. He had been searching for easy targets, houses with no dogs, and he had stumbled on their neighborhood. Brian did not respond when the officer told them that. He only turned his head and locked eyes with his neighbors. And there it was, the guilt, the regret, the shame. It all came tumbling out. Mrs. Thompson looked down at her feet, and Mr. Thompson ran a hand through his hair. They had tried to kill his dog, and tonight that same dog had saved their lives. Brian met their eyes, then delivered the final blow. Imagine if Tank hadn't made it. The couple's eyes misted over. "We are?" They started to apologize, but Brian stopped them. There was nothing they could say, no apology that could erase what they had done. Brian turned on his heel and walked out of the room. Tank followed beside him, ever loyal and faithful, and just like that, they disappeared into the night, leaving their neighbors standing with the cops. Everything changed after that night. Tank soon recovered enough to run around the yard again, barking at birds and furry creatures. But the Thompsons never complained again. They never looked at Brian the same way, either. They brought gifts and treats for Tank and tried to be close to the dog they had wanted dead. But they were not the only ones. The other neighbors heard about that big night, and the news soon spread to different parts of the town. Many of them sent gifts to Tank, as they too realized how important he was to their neighborhood. The neighborhood never forgot. The Thompsons never complained again. And Tank? He got all the treats he wanted. Do you think dogs have a sixth sense of justice? Have you ever heard of a pet turning the tables like this? Let us know in the comments. Brian knew revenge wasn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it was about waiting. And in the end, Tank got the last word. But this is not the only time a dog has excitingly turned the tables. Subscribe for more real-life stories of loyalty, karma, and the unbelievable moments that leave everyone speechless.